I think this whole conversation kind of leads us to the question of like, and you kind of mentioned it, like when your finances go to shit, like what do you do? Like, what are the next steps? And so I came across this question where someone was kind of dealing with a similar situation. And so this person wrote, I finally landed my first job and now I'm getting laid off. I recently finished grad school and landed a great job. It was a tough process that took 6 months of applying and interviewing, but all the work looked like it was finally paying off. The job required me to relocate, so I spent all the money I managed to save during grad school to move to the area. At the end of my first week, I was informed that due to federal funding cuts, my job will be the first to get cut, and this is my 2 months notice. I'm feeling hopeless and devastated as my finances were finally starting to look good after about 10 years of scraping by in school. To make things worse, my student loan grace period is about to end. What options do I have?
This is so terrible. And I feel like when employers have someone like relocate and then lay them off like 2 days later, that is, I don't know. I don't like that. It's very, I don't know. I've been laid off before. It's not a good feeling. It's very scary to know that like soon you're not going to have a paycheck coming in. But this person especially, like they just got out of school. So who knows really what kind of, what their finances look like. Do they have any type of emergency fund and their student loans grace period's about to end? Of course, there's always the first thing I think of, of course their student loan grace period is ending, but there's always deferment because of job loss, things like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you do when you're laid off if you don't have any other options? Probably go and try to find another job. If you just got out of grad school, I'm guessing you have a little bit more flexibility with where you can look for work. I don't know. I just feel like a lot of times, like when in these situations, like it is super scary, especially because if the person doesn't have, doesn't have like an emergency fund or anything, there's a lot that could go wrong. But I mean, the first things first, you have 2 months notice. That's a lot. So for me, I'm not going to freak out yet in this situation. Like I'm going to continue about my life. I'm probably going to like tighten things up and not do any type of like discretionary spending. I'm going to save as much as I can over these next 2 months. And I'm also going to be on LinkedIn every single day applying for jobs like immediately. So I think this question's a little bit different. Like if this person said in 2 weeks they're done, like it'd be a little bit different for me. But for 2 months, I'm riding it out, saving as much money as possible, and also literally applying to every single job that I can.
Yeah, I think a 2 months notice is pretty generous. Most people, especially with recent layoffs, are being told like, hey, by the end of today, we need you gone. Ugh. Or like you said, at best, it's like a 2 week period. And so to say 2 months, I think that gives you so much runway to plan ahead for this. But yeah, like you said, buttoning down, what is that saying? Like buttoning down the hatches. I think you really got to get clear. It's a saying, I promise. I think you really got to get clear on what all the numbers look like. If you're moving to a new area, is this a higher cost of living area, lower cost of living area? Like, can you potentially move into a cheaper place? I'm sure you just signed a lease, but yeah, I think really looking at what I always like to call like your baseline budget number, like what do you absolutely need to bring in to make sure that you can put food on the table, that you can get to and from work, that your housing's covered, your lights stay on. Like, I think you really got to understand all the numbers to know, all right, when it comes down to this, like in 2 months, if I don't have another job lined up, how much do I need to be bringing in at a minimum just to get by?
Yeah, for sure. Now, like I said, my answer is different between like 2 months and 2 weeks. But let's say, this person is like at a 2 weeks, which is crazy. If they were to relocate this person and then at the end of their first week, they say you're done in 2 weeks, that's crazy. But at that point, I feel like things are really rough. Like you're probably going to have to get several side hustles, attempts to break your lease if you can, and just let them know like you're not going to have a job and potentially have to move back home or wherever, whatever that looks like for you. Things are going to look a little different at that point. But, for right now, I'm definitely going to try to like you said, keep a baseline budget, really just like tighten things up. And I'm not doing anything outside of being in my house applying for jobs at this point. But I don't know. I think this person has more, they're hopeless, devastated, whatever, but I feel like they have a lot more. There's a lot of good things that I think could come from this. Maybe this wasn't the right job for them and the other job is just around the corner. I truly believe in stuff like that. Like I said, I've been laid off. It was not fun and I didn't get a notice at all. I woke up and it was a bad time in my life. I woke up and I just had lost access to my computer. And then they paid us for the next 2 weeks and we were on our way from that point. So yeah, I definitely know what this is like.
Yeah, that's a pretty rough send off for sure. I don't know. I like when I was reading this, like an idea popped in my head and I was like, is this kind of like a crazy idea or not? Like, I'm a big believer in like, like the free market. Like I think companies need to do what's going to be best for the market to provide the best possible value. But at the same time, like I feel like especially in cases like this where you're asking someone to relocate, like most jobs I would say have like a 6 month like probationary period where they can kind of assess you, make sure that you can do the job adequately. But I feel like that almost needs to go both ways too, where it's like, hey, you can't ask me to move halfway across the country or relocate cities, sign a new lease, and then just let me go, 2 weeks or a month later. Like, barring you not being able to perform the job well or you being like a total asshole, I feel like the job should also be able to make a commitment that says, hey, we've set aside like in our budget the funds to pay you for at least 6 months while we test you out as well. And there's a fine line there that I think could make this not an ideal situation where people could take advantage of it. But like, I feel like it has to go both ways. That level of trust, it's where you're saying, hey, I'm going to allow you to assess if I'm a good fit for your company, but you also got to give me like the comfort of knowing like, hey, for the next 6 months, like I'm employed, I'm good, and then we reevaluate at the end of those 6 months. But yeah, this is just such a shitty situation. And I feel like when someone hears this, like the very first thing they got to do is just get all their numbers in order. Yeah. Like I said, like really get clear on what that baseline budget number is and know that, all right, when I lose this job, if there's not something lined up, like whether it's through picking up like a part-time job or like you said, side hustles or DoorDash, whatever it is, like this is the number I have to hit. And you're just focused on getting by right now until you can land another job. I feel like that's really like the only approach they can take.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like, if we're talking about this person right now who's, pretty fresh on the scene here, how can we, help other people in the future to not be in this situation? I feel, whenever you're just starting, and we've learned this, you're starting your career, you don't think this is going to happen to you. Again, another one of those situations where it can happen to me, right? But if there's anything we've learned over the past, 2 to 3 years, layoffs can happen, and they do happen at a massive scale, So I think the biggest thing is knowing that you're not immune to this. I don't care how big your jobs are. Big tech saw a big uptick in layoffs over the past few years for sure. So I think the biggest thing is to be prepared for this. Don't kind of have your head in the sand and think I have a stable job that I don't really need to prepare for this type of thing for. I didn't know my layoff was coming, but I was very scared because it was in big tech. And so I had been kind of stuffing more money aside. We already had our emergency fund and stuff, but I actually put more money aside than I probably needed to. And then whenever I did get laid off, yes, it really hurt, but I knew that I was okay, at least for the next several months until I could find another job. Thank goodness I was only off for 7 weeks without pay until I found a new job. But that's kind of what I did. Just if you are in kind of an industry like that, otherwise just have your normal emergency fund there, just so you can fall back on it and you're not in this situation where you're like, student loans are coming, I just moved here and I am terrified of what's going to happen to me,
Oh, 100%. That level of planning ahead is so critical. And even when my wife and I, when we moved from California to Texas, that was a big risk as well, financially. And so we had to really be clear, all right, one, we're moving at the timeline that you can get employed by. For my wife, she had a job lined up for when we moved. 2 weeks later, she had her first day. That was a critical part of it. But then also, like you said, just having those backup funds to be able to reassure yourself, hey, if you were to get let go from this job in a month or 2 months or 3 months, we have enough cash to be able to, and this might be stretching the budget a little bit, but to last us 6 months to a year, just to give you that peace of mind, that flexibility to say, all right, I can take the time to look for another job, worst case, and I think you got to really put it to yourself to plan ahead like that. You got to put it to yourself to say hey, part of this is also on me as well. We talked a lot about it in one of our last episodes where it's you also have to take accountability for your situation and the range of outcomes that could present themselves. You got to be aware of what could happen. And if you're not planning ahead for those, part of the responsibility is on you as well.
Absolutely. And I feel like this relates back to what we were just talking about at the beginning of the episode, when people are living paycheck to paycheck, just kind of living their lifestyle, but they're not, budgeting to get ahead or anything like that, because this is the kind of stuff that's going to completely just ruin you financially if you're not ready for it. let's say I was living paycheck to paycheck when I got laid off and then I was off work for 7 weeks. Like that's scary. You know, if I didn't have any funds like that, I probably would have had to live off credit cards, you know, because we still had our house payment, we still had bills and you had to eat. Right. You know, so I think that's the big thing too. Like you said, getting prepared, and there's some sort of, you know, accountability on your end, like to be able to, you know, set some of these things aside and realize that something like this could happen to you in the future, and just being prepared for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you're not safe until you have an emergency fund, until your finances are in order. Like you really got to be planning ahead. And like for people who are listening to this and like, what can I take away from this is like, if you're not in this situation where you're about to be laid off in 2 weeks, or you're not living, you know, paycheck to paycheck by whatever terms you think that means to you, like, do you have the flexibility in your budget to be setting aside money, to be building up the savings, to make sure that there's layers of like financial security to fall back on? You know, like maybe layer 1 is like, all right, I have some extra cash set aside. Layer 2 is like, I built up that fully funded emergency fund. Okay, worst case, if this was a disaster situation, like I could pull the money that's in my Roth IRA, you know, like you have these layers before you end up on the street, basically is what I'm saying, right? You have all these layers to protect you for what you could do if you were in a disaster situation where you had all of these expenses and you suddenly lose your job.
The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.